Right, so imagine you go on to do the Sunday morning politics rounds and you get presented with the death toll to aid workers in Gaza at the hands of Israeli forces. Imagine you get asked about that in the context of the legal advice you've been given. Legal advice, which of course we know the Tories continue to refuse to publish, and get asked to justify that lack of transparency in the context of those deaths, which of course under international humanitarian law are never events. They should never happen. Well, the honest answer, of course, is the only answer, is that all of these deaths are obviously war crimes, and obviously Israel has to be held responsible for them as part of a wider investigation into the litany of war crimes they have committed. But the Tory answer, as delivered this morning, those humanitarian deaths are apparently justified, because Israel has a right to defend itself, even against people it illegally occupies. This was a truly rancid interview. Please mind your blood pressure as you keep watching.
Under international law, aid workers must be protected. The United Nations says that almost 200 have been killed in Gaza. Do you think Israel's acting within the law in that regard?
Well, as you'll appreciate, Laura, I'm not going to preempt, or indeed it's the case the government is not publishing legal advice in respect of international humanitarian law. I think the starting point, though, for all of this, and you said at the top of this, and I think it's quite easy to forget, 6 months ago, Israel was subject to the most appalling attack. We know all the details of that, but Israel is still facing this existential threat from Hamas. It's a nation in trauma, and it is prosecuting a legitimate war of self-defense. Now, of course, in the conduct of that war, we are holding Israel to very high standards. Higher standards, of course, than we would have of the terrorist organization Hamas. Now, in the context of that, we're engaging with Israel on a number of issues. First of all, this point about deconflicting, to make sure that they are not targeting aid workers, and they've got a process for doing that. And we've had robust conversations. The Prime Minister had conversations with Prime Minister Netanyahu. Foreign Secretary Cameron had those conversations. Secondly, we of course need to get more aid into Gaza to alleviate the humanitarian suffering. The people of Gaza have suffered under Hamas. They're now suffering as a result of that. And you've seen today the announcements that we've made in terms of opening that aid corridor. So we're engaging across a wide range of issues with Israel in the context of a country that is fighting to defend itself in its biggest challenge since its foundation.
And that is the important context, and we've made those points already. But on this very important question, do you believe that Israel is acting within the law?
Well, I think that Israel is conducting a legitimate campaign, and it is doing so in a very, very difficult environment.
Right, so that was, of course, Tory Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden. They're appearing to justify the deaths of aid workers in the context of Israel's right to defend itself, despite that very much being against international humanitarian law. But he just couldn't bring himself to say it, could he? He was simply asked if Israel is acting within humanitarian law in regard to the deaths of those aid workers for the World Central Kitchen at the beginning of this week, and the answer is always going to be no, surely. We know what the law says in regards to aid workers, so it should have been a straightforward no from Dowden, shouldn't it? But this guy's a Tory. This is a guy who gets sent out on the media rounds because he can do the full-on waffle and bluster routine for several minutes while saying absolutely nothing, and he came out with several irreverent points, but all of which can only ever be read as justification for the deaths of those aid workers in this context. And he just never should have gone there. We know what the law is, but Dowden decided to hide behind the fact the government are not publishing the legal advice they've received. They can keep sticking to that line all they like. We know the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Alicia Cairns, said in leaked audio back on the 13th of March that the government advice has been that Israel are in breach of international law. And indeed, the law itself is not hidden from us. International humanitarian law is widely well known, publicly known. Of course, it has to be. But if the government had been told any different, it would be bad advice, of course, in which case, particularly in the context of the deaths of these aid workers, not to mention all the other protected groups that we've seen killed in Gaza, such as health workers and journalists. So saying we're not preempting or not second-guessing government advice simply doesn't wash, because the law is what it is, and we know it is illegal to kill aid workers. Aid workers are being killed. So the advice the government have been given is irrelevant. Just state the facts. And this is particular since the question was put to Dowden for his view. But he couldn't even offer that. Deciding to hide behind the government line, though, says much more about him. But it got even worse. It's easy to forget how all this started, he went on. It's easy also to forget the question he was actually asked too, it seems. He was asked about aid worker deaths, so everything that followed was just justification for that, given that he refused to say Israel were breaking international humanitarian law. So why should any of us be surprised or any less appalled that he chooses to take us all back to that night of October 7th, as if it's the only one that ever matters? As if not only were the aid worker deaths irrelevant, but so has everything Israel had done in Gaza in the 6 months since. That's the only way, surely, that doing this can be read, in the context of the question he was asked by Laura Koonsberg. It was one night. There is no excusing the atrocities committed by either side on that night. Both sides are implicated in it. To what extent each are requires independent investigation, not yet able to happen. So nobody is excusing Hamas at all. But equally, Israel are known to have committed their own atrocities on that night, with tanks and with helicopter gunships, which must have been them because Hamas doesn't possess them. It was an appalling attack, Dowden says, but bear in mind too, it was an attempt to take hostages to demand exchanges for their own people that Israel hold. Israel hold 10 times the number of hostages that Hamas do, but who the media repeatedly ignore because presumably it doesn't fit the chosen narratives and the pro-Israel bias. Dowden wasn't going to slow down here, though. Israel is a nation in trauma, exercising a war of self-defense. Well, what of Gaza then? 33,000 people dead, but Israel's right to self-defense. 33,000 people dead and counting, many more times the casualty rate that happened in Israel on October 7th. Many of those deaths attributable to Israel itself at that. But so what of Gaza's trauma here? What of their right to self-defense? In fact, if Dowden was honest in his knowledge of international law, which I'm sure he is really in this given situation, he'd know an occupying force has no right to self-defense against those it occupies. It actually has a duty of care towards them instead. The occupied, however, they've got every right to resist that occupation. And whatever your feelings are towards Hamas and what they do and what they have done, and certainly I'm not going to imply at any point here that they're angels in all of this, they are a resistance to occupation. They formed in response to Israeli occupation. I dare say a great many people argue over this point, but it seems very straightforward to me. This is not a legitimate war of self-defense. But then he comes to the high standards we're apparently holding Israel to. Is that what Rishi Sunak was doing when he told Netanyahu that he hopes he wins? Is that what we're doing by allowing military flights into and out of the UK by Israeli aircraft? Is that what we're doing by allowing the US to conduct military operations of we know not for certain what nature from our RAF base out on Cyprus? Is that what continuing to sell them weapons is doing? Is that what allowing Israeli arms factories to continue operating in our country are doing? In what way are we, the UK, holding Israel to any sort of standard in what they are doing, given they have razed Israel to the ground from north to south, destroyed schools, hospitals, homes, lives, dropping 2,000-pound bombs on refugee camps, 33,000 people dead, over 100,000 if you include the number of injured and missing into that tally, people now dying faster of starvation than at the hands of the IDF and Israeli security forces, and this is your high standard, is it? Well, Dowden came to that, no word of a lie. He claimed part of that was ensuring Israel were not targeting aid workers. In other words, what? Israel can't be trusted to not do that without being put on a leash? If that is what you've been doing, then we've failed ourselves more than 200 times. I'm not buying what you're selling here, sunshine. He finally did acknowledge the fact that people of Gaza have suffered, though he decided to talk about the people of Gaza having suffered under Hamas rather than Israeli atrocity, despite Hamas actually being the elected government there. I'm not going to completely exonerate Hamas on that issue either, though. They've not held elections since 2006. They really should have done. That's not on, is it? But let's not pretend that that's been the issue here, certainly since last October, and in no small part before that. Why did the people of Gaza choose to elect Hamas to begin with at all, after all? But listening to Dowden, You might think that 6 months into its assault on Gaza, Israel is still defending itself in the context of support the UK is giving them, and that the people of Gaza don't warrant the same consideration. It's certainly how this came across to me. Koonsberg, after letting him emit this guff for nearly 2 minutes straight, finally chipped back in, reiterating the original question, which of course he hadn't answered. And it then became about a legitimate campaign being conducted in a difficult environment as he continued to not answer that question. Absolute nonsense. What Oliver Dowden did there was show to the public exactly why Tory MP Alan Duncan named Dowden in his list of people with pro-Israel loyalties to the detriment of their British loyalties, in his view. Arguments against producing the legal advice this government are apparently following is weak when we know what international law says. And if the advice they have is in agreement with that, what's the issue then? Oh yes, because it would mean the government are intentionally not following it, wouldn't it? They are preventing opposition parties, campaign groups, ordinary people up and down this country holding the government to account for withholding that legal advice over their continued support for Israel, and that's corrupt. We need to know what they are doing in our name. That's in line with international law we're signed up to, and if they are not doing that, that needs explaining to us. The longer this fudge over withholding the legal advice goes on, the guiltier these Tories look, and no amount of preening excuse-making from the likes of Dowden will solve that. There are a good many Tories, and equally Labour MPs and representatives too, who need to pick a side right now, seemingly still unable to, even after the deaths of those 7 aid workers earlier, not to mention, of course, the 33,000 Palestinian deaths up to date and counting, because it's a question that's not going to go away from both main parties, as this video recommendation here lays out all the details of. And I'll hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.